بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Welcome Sunday night, Reforming the Self with Raghib Asfahani. And I apologize for being late. I was having some technical difficulties. This is a really important section that Raghib Asfahani, our author, is getting into. Again, we're in the section about knowledge and everything that's related to it. The next thing that Raghib Asfahani, the author, is trying to communicate is the importance of being well-rounded, right? So what he's talking about here is trying to push back against the need to emphasize specialization. Why? And this is something that I think is timely because in our society and even in the Muslim community, often we understand how the world works, right? And we monetize our skills fairly effectively. We kind of, we focused in on, okay, STEM is where the jobs are, and get your kid involved in STEM and focus on these particular areas, and they're going to be employable and have a comfortable life and be more marriageable, etc., etc., etc. All of that's well and good, right? But we need to be careful, and we live in a moment in the United States where we see the effects of a populace who is ill-educated in general, right? The reading level of adults has just plummeted as the decades have gone by. Most adults don't read books anymore, right? They get their news from social media. They're not reading articles or books or things like that. We've become a much more entertainment-based society. And I think we're starting to see the results of that when it comes to the status of the viability of our democracy, or at least the viability of its electorate, right? And so Raghib Asfahani has a message for us in our times, which is that, okay, you can leverage one particular field or something that is, monetizable, or something that is going to provide a good job, but that should not be the end of your education, because education is not simply in order to get paid, right? Education is to develop yourself as a human being and to prepare yourself to take on the responsibility of being Allah's representative here on earth. And so if that's true, is calculus and biology and medicine kind of, and throw in engineering perhaps, maybe law, is that sufficient? Are those fields the fields that are kind of the most sought after fields in education? Are they sufficient to be Allah's representative on earth? No, they're not. They're not. And so Raghib Asfahani, he talks about being well-rounded and how this is an important thing. He says one of the kind of reasons why being well-rounded is important is because it makes you relatable to people, right? If in certain circles, right, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Society is the way it is. It's fairly obsessed with entertainment and sport, etc., etc. If you don't know anything about that, you're not going to be able to connect with a certain group of people, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, speak to people at the level where they're at. If you're going to talk to a doctor, you might use a metaphor or an analogy that's based in anatomy or medicine. If you're talking to a farmer, you're going to need to use an entirely different set of analogies and metaphors. If you're talking to somebody who's into sports or into entertainment, knowing a little bit about it, enough to just be able to make small talk, is actually a very, very useful thing. And so we see that there can be two extremes, right? Let's take something like sports, where we have a lot of people in our society that the amount of knowledge that they have about sports is extreme, right? To know so much about sports that it detracts from things that are much more impactful on people's lives, on the environment around you, on uplifting society, etc., etc., is blameworthy, right? You don't need to know, the personal history of every single star basketball player or what team they were on before, all these other sorts of things, right? But then on the other extreme, to not know absolutely anything about it, and this is something that many people are connecting to and emotionally attached to in some sort of way, kind of leaves you on the outside looking in. So being able to relate is one of the reasons to be well-rounded. Another thing that the author says, being well-rounded gives you the ability to analyze something from multiple angles, right? So, and that is something that we have seen in our society. With specialization comes a type of myopia, right? Where you're kind of only able to isolate a variable and imagine that this one variable is responsible for all these sorts of changes, when really it's the lack of your education or the lack of being well-rounded in your education that really prevents you from seeing all these sorts of different factors that are affecting things, right? I think that people have realized, and this is kind of behind the whole movement for interdisciplinary work, etc., various crossovers and panels that cut across disciplines have realized that if you take things out of context and only look at them from one angle, you actually end up missing a large part of the picture, right? We saw that with the pandemic, right? You have medical professionals that you can get down all the medicine, you can understand the public health aspect of things, but we realize at the end of the day that we're hamstrung by politics, right? By the ability to convince people, trust, media, messaging, PR, public relations, and God forbid someone politicizes the issue, then you have to now get into politics. How are we going to, okay, we might be right, but how are we going to affect this change in the environment or the social moment or the historical moment in which we live? It takes someone who's well-rounded to be able to look at things from all those sorts of different perspectives. You could maybe make an analogy with biodiversity, right? The principle of Allah's creation is that strength is in diversity. You have one entire field of just corn, okay? Well, what have you done? You've eliminated the food for all the insects except for one insect, that one insect that feeds off of corn, right? So all the other insects don't have enough food to live there. They either die or move somewhere else. Because they die or move somewhere else, the birds and other creatures that feed off of them die or go somewhere else, right? And now you have a very imbalanced ecosphere. You have one crop, it provides this amazing food supply for this one particular type of insect. The population of that one insect explodes, causing more harm to the crop. It's too much for its predator to be able to keep up with. You need to intervene with chemicals, all these sorts of things, right? It's a very, very weak ecosystem. Whereas if you have crop rotation and you have interplanting, or you have all these different types of organisms, you'll actually find that the insects that feed off of some organisms will consume the insects that eat off of other organisms. And so you actually achieve a balance. And so that ecosystem is much more resilient and much more robust and much more sustainable. The same thing goes with the ecosphere of our knowledge and our interests. If you're only interested in one or two things very narrowly, right, you're going to be very, very limited. You're only going to be able to look at things from a couple different angles, and you're not really going to be able to connect with others or impact kind of the area around you. Whereas if you have a intellectual kind of milieu where you have a whole different set of experiences and at least a little bit in various different fields, and you're going to have a much more kind of robust intellectual take on things. Another principle that he mentions about being well-rounded is taking the good and leaving the evil or useless, right? So he says now, if we can think about being well-rounded in one way, when we think about like a buffet of all these types of disciplines and the importance of taking at least something from every station at the buffet, right? But now the author wants to draw our attention to, what are we choosing from that buffet when we get there? There's everything that's within that station is not equal. There's some things that are just full of, sugar and trans fats, and they're going to make you obese and give you diabetes. And then there's other things that are actually quite pure for you and are going to build, contribute to your health and contribute to your nourishment, right? And so his analogy here is, when you're at every station in the buffet, don't just blindly take like any sort of trivia, right? This is how we get to trivia. The author isn't saying to know little disconnected facts from every little discipline. He's saying, no, take the most beneficial and useful thing from every field. And whatever's not useful, or even worse than that, whatever's detrimental, then leave it, right? And so there's things like, even like poetry, for example, like or spoken word or art, or all these sorts of different fields where we might look at them sideways, like, oh, how's that benefiting society? It's not like, part of the hard sciences, or not rigorous enough or something like that. But there are tremendous things to take from them, and there's useless things too, and there's worse than that, right? There's some poetry that is extremely lewd, or atheistic or blasphemous, and then there's some poetry that can reach the human soul with a positive message in a much more powerful way than you and I can do with this lecture or talking to people like this, right? Art is the same way. There's art that is blasphemous. There's art that is just vain and useless. And there's art that is purposeful and actually very, very profound, right? So we can take the best from every subject and kind of add it to our arsenal of intellectual experiences, and that makes us a more well-rounded person. That makes us a beneficial person. That makes us a person who is developed to the point where they can contribute to society, and they can be eligible and suitable to represent Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. And the example that struck me from the seerah was the example of Salman al-Farisi, who during the Battle of the Trench, which is named for a battle tactic that he suggested, right? The entire Arabian Peninsula had united against the Muslims. It was the final showdown, right? 10,000 soldiers against the 3,000 inhabitants of Medina. And the inhabitants of Medina, the believers, could not possibly resist. So they were taking shura, they were asking each other what they should do. And Salman, who was from Persia, suggested, he said, in my land, what we do in such a scenario is we dig a large trench, and the other army, it doesn't matter how many people they have, they can't cross the trench. And so then it's just about siege, and they eventually go away, right? And nobody kind of criticized Salman. Nobody said, oh, what a stupid idea, or this is an innovation, or, where's your evidence from the Quran and Sunnah for this thing? No, this is about dunya. This is not an act of worship, at least not a specific legislated act of worship like prayer. And so they took it. They said, this is a great idea. They took the best of, warfare or military tactics. Doesn't matter who came up with it. They took the idea, they implemented it with great success. It saved the day, right? And it kind of saved the Islamic movement. So that's the way that we should be. We should be with all kind of intellectual fields and disciplines, looking for those things that are beneficial. There's a weak hadith, it's not authentic from the Prophet ﷺ, but the meaning is true, that said that the statement of a wise person, or the wise statement, is the property of the believer, right? It's like lost and found, right? If you find something that's a wise statement, no matter who says it, we don't say as Muslims, oh, this person is a blasphemer, this person's an innovator, this person's a disbeliever, this person's an idolater, they're an atheist, or whatever. If the statement is true, we take it and we benefit from it, right? And this is, we have a precedent for this in the Quran, because in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he's telling the story of Sheba and Solomon, Saba and Sulaiman, right? Saba, the queen of Sheba, is worshiping the sun. She is as idolatrous as someone can be, right? And the letter of Solomon comes to her, inviting her to Islam. and she asks her legion of advisors, she asks them, okay, what should we do with this? Should we fight them? Should we go to war? Or should we just kind of try to work this out in a diplomatic sense? And they say to her, listen, if you want to go to war, we're ready. And if you want to do it diplomatically, we can do that too. It's up to you. She comes back and says, whenever two nations go to war, the cost is that it wipes out the people of talent, like the talented people on both sides. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ يَفْعَلُونَ. And he says, and that's exactly what happens. He didn't say, don't listen to this idolater. Right? He didn't do an ad hominem. He didn't attack her for the positionality from which she was speaking. He didn't say, well, you're white cis hetero, right? And so you can't say anything of value. No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took the statement. Is the statement true? Yes, it is. Benefit from it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala confirmed it, and so we benefit from that statement with the overall lesson that war is undesirable if we can avoid it. So this is part of the author's reasoning for why being well-rounded is extremely important, and how to be well-rounded. You take the good things from each discipline and you leave that which is evil or useless. And the reason why he's bringing this up is so that nobody can make a false dilemma or make a straw man and try to say, well, we can't benefit from art because look at this, and they're giving the worst examples of art, right? Or, well, we can't, it's haram to get involved with this because look at this worst example of this, etc., etc. Right? This happened with protests, right? Not too long ago, when at the end of Ramadan and the issues were having, the oppression and the aggression in Palestine was happening. There were some people that were putting out videos saying protesting is haram, demonstrations are haram, etc., etc., which I disagree with entirely. And part of their reasoning was, well, look at the mob violence that takes place, riots, and etc., etc. Well, this is exactly what the author is cautioning us against. We can't dismiss the entire idea of, or the practice of, protests and demonstrations just because the worst case scenario or the worst example, right? You can't compare a riot to a candlelight vigil, right? You can't even recognize one for the other. They're completely different things. So we don't simply dismiss an entire category of experiences or intellectual pursuits just because of some of the most egregious examples. No, there's room to take the beneficial and to leave what isn't. Of course, realizing that the beneficial is in the service of this project, the service of establishing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, establishing justice, and developing ourselves to become worthy representatives of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. Then the author wants to say that, okay, being well-rounded is important, but we want to get to some things before we get to others. He said there has to be some sort of prioritization with these different subjects. You go to the buffet line, okay, to bring back to our example, and you don't just load up on dessert, right? You have to build from the beginning to the middle to the end. Certain things come first, right? So when it comes to benefiting from the dunya and these sorts of intellectual fields or disciplines, they always have to be secondary to our knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the knowledge of the Shariah, which is what Allah expects of us, how Allah wants to be loved and obeyed and worshipped in this world, right? These are the priorities, especially knowing who Allah is, right? They have to come first. And then once we have enough, from those respective fields, then we can pursue others and then keep on going down the list until we get to maybe the least significant ones. And the final thing that he says about a thing to look out for when becoming well-rounded is be careful to implement what you learn. He compares somebody, he says, don't let your knowledge exceed your practice of knowledge, right? You should be implementing and applying those things that you learn. whether it is in order to connect with other people, whether it is to benefit the community in various types of ways. He says, don't be like someone who's gathering or stockpiling weapons and ends up never shooting a single round, right? What a waste. If you're going to take the time to go down this path of developing your intellect, then make sure that it is being applied and it's benefiting other people. The next section, or the next chapter that the author gets into, he starts to talk about essential characteristics for students. And then he talks about, after that, the following chapter, essential characteristics of teachers. And this is a good reminder for me, and I really benefited preparing for this class, reading some of these reminders. So when it comes to students, what are the characteristics of a good student? What must the good student have if they want to be able to benefit or develop themselves, become well-rounded, become a worthy representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The first thing the author says is purifying oneself from poor etiquette. And this is something that we say a lot in Islam, but we need to explain a little bit what we mean, right? Poor etiquette is not just, oh, he extended his feet towards the Qibla, or he put the Quran down on a carpet, right? Or he's not sitting in the right position or stuff like that. This is things that we've come to kind of micromanage and think of as etiquette. And I'm not saying that those things don't have any importance, but they are not nearly as important as the etiquette of the heart, right? We're talking about avoiding haste. Haste is poor etiquette for a student, right? How many times do we see a student, usually the precocious ones, the ones that have talent or potential, and they want to interrupt and finish the teacher's sentence, right? Or they want to get ahead of themselves and jump to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, right? This is poor etiquette as a student, because you're not fully submitting to the teacher's plan for you when it comes to how your education should unfold. And we're going to deal with more specific guidance for that in a second. So haste is poor etiquette. A good student should not be hasty. They should realize, they should trust that the educator, the instructor, has a plan, and that plan exists in time, right? And part of the qualification of a teacher or an instructor is the timing of exposure. Another thing that is poor etiquette from a student is jealousy of other students. This happens a lot. Especially, I traveled abroad. I studied in Medina. I saw this happen. Students get jealous of each other. This one is closer to the sheikh. This one gets better grades or does better on the tests, right? And at the very least, it stops people from cooperating. At the very worst, it ends up being the cause for what people will claim to be a religious conflict. So-and-so is an innovator. So-and-so is not a real student of Islam. So-and-so is a fake or a phony. And really, if you go back to what the issue really is about, it's often about jealousy. It's often about jealousy. But people, because they cannot admit that about themselves, they have not done this thing the author says, they have not purified themselves spiritually before starting to learn. They have poor etiquette. Now they're going to try to take down other people who are seen as rivals to them due to their jealousy. There were a couple humorous stories that, that happened to me in Medina to show kind of this, because people, they imagine what studying in Medina is like, and they imagine that, everybody's so pious and mashallah, but, every place and every person struggles with these issues. So one time I was in Masjid Quba, in Medina, and Masjid Quba, obviously one of the more famous masajid in the Muslim world. And Sheikh Salih Al Fawzan was there, or was visiting from Riyadh, and he's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, scholar in Saudi Arabia. So he was coming to give a lesson, and it was right after Maghrib prayer. So it was packed, right? All these students or whatever, okay? And everyone was looking around. They're wondering, is the sheikh going to lead the prayer? Like, whatever, okay? But he doesn't come at first. And so everybody, they're praying, probably very distracted in their prayers, right? And then, I kid you not, as soon as everybody said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody got up and ran to the front of the masjid. It was like a stampede. And I was not prepared for that. So like I ended up, kind of bumbling and stumbling through the crowd. But they were all trying to get closest to the front so they could be closest to the sheikh, right? But people are getting, stepped on and, all these sorts of things. So, not necessarily the best etiquette for students of this faith. Another example, I used to attend Sheikh Abdullah Shinqiti's tafsir lessons in the Prophet's Masjid 4 days a week. And there was a class that was immediately after his. Okay. And the students for the class that were after his, they did not have the best behavior. They were not very, very well mannered, in my opinion. And so they would like stand around while we're listening to the sheikh is talking, and they're standing up and they're kind of just like waiting, which is a little bit rude in the first place. And then as soon as the adhan sounds and we kind of are, dismissing or whatever, they do the same thing, rush in to try to get the spot. And I kid you not, one time I was knocked over. I was knocked off my feet, sat down on, involuntarily sat down by one of these students trying to get his spot at a lesson and not having decent etiquette when it came to his other fellow students. Everybody kind of feeling each other as rivals, competitors, as opposed to helping each other and working together. So I think back on those stories and I laugh sometimes. The author says another key characteristic for a student is to focus on your studies. Don't get distracted by the dunya. Right? And this would be the difference between the person who is lost in entertainment. They got the season pass on their direct TV or whatever, and they're watching all the soccer games or all the basketball games, as opposed to reading ESPN once a week to see who won what, just to be able to talk to the normal people, right? It also has to do with being organized with your time. And setting a schedule for yourself, right? Not just floating through life in this kind of catch as catch can sort of mentality. No, you have to be focused. You have to be organized. Don't get distracted. And you set a schedule for yourself and you do the best you can. And you'll be shocked at how much progress you can make. The author then says, avoid arrogance towards your instructor, and avoid arrogance toward the subject that you're studying. And this hit me hard because this is a big, big problem. East and West, North America and the Muslim world. Big, big, big problem, right? There are people who will argue with the teacher, who, not because they don't understand anything. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for the be quiet beta and just do what I say. There's a way to ask questions. There's an etiquette and a manner and a tone of voice and a way to approach a question. Or there's even a way to disagree or to try to uncover a contradiction that you see. There's a way for that. But a lot of people, they come at it in a very arrogant way. They think that they know more than the teacher. And so like, how can you say this? And how can you say that? And how can you say that? And this is wrong, and this is wrong, etc. And I saw that, like I said, East and West. When they were in the West, when I was at Vassar, they teach you how to criticize Marx before you read Marx. They teach you how to criticize Foucault before you read Foucault, and so on and so forth. right? So they're pushing you to always be hyper critical. Yes, but he didn't, attend to feminist concerns, or yes, but his analysis of economy was whatever, and you haven't even read the person yet, right? Like every sort of discipline of knowledge is a conversation, right? If you're going for the, I'm a political theory guy, so it's like if you're going through, okay, Locke was in conversation with people who came before him, and then Marx is in conversation with those guys before him, and so on and so forth. It's a conversation, right? So to thrust yourself into this conversation at the very end and just be playing referee, like this guy got it wrong, this guy got it right, this guy had no idea what he was talking about. It's a very arrogant disposition to have. And this is something that regretfully is encouraged of us, especially in the liberal arts colleges, North America, et cetera, et cetera. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said there's two types of people that don't learn. One of them is the arrogant person. He can't learn because he already thinks he knows. And the other person is the shy person, the timid person that's too afraid to ask, which is honestly at its base another version of arrogance, in that the person is afraid of exposing the fact that they don't know. Right? So think about learning a foreign language as an adult, right? The people who learn the language are people who throw themselves out there and make the mistakes. Like, yep, I'm going to make mistakes. Here I go. Bismillah. Let's do it. Because they know that failing is actually the path to correction and learning. Whereas some people, they're too proud. They don't want to be wrong. They don't want to show other people what they don't know. And so they refrain from speaking, they refrain from trying, and they end up learning at least much slower, if not less. There's also a well-known saying in Islamic disciplines that knowledge of anything won't give itself to you until you give all of yourself to it. And that's not to say that you need to become, obsessive and just, obsessing about studying, and, you don't sleep and you don't, eat. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about putting yourself in a literally docile position, right? Willing to be molded. And this is an extremely important characteristic to have if you want to learn something, and something that people both East and West have recognized for centuries and centuries and centuries, right? Some people sometimes, they want me to come to their house to teach their kids Islam, okay? And I understand, I get it. It's like it kind of follows like a tutor kind of model, et cetera, et cetera. But it can also kind of send the message to your children that, you can do everything in the comfort of your own home. Like, why don't you come to the masjid where the imam is, right? Why don't you get in the class with everybody else that everybody else is doing, right? There's kind of a, you have to give in order to get, right? Yeah, I mean, we can spoon feed all you want. I mean, I can come to your house and I can break it down. I can make a whole curriculum for you and whatever. If your kid doesn't have the motivation, they're playing FIFA and they're like, oh, like, hold on, I'm almost done, right? This happens, then how are they going to really learn? What have they shown? What have they demonstrated about their commitment to learning or their motivation for learning in the first place? It's not there. So I'll just be talking to a wall, and that's not beneficial for anybody. It's like Musa alayhi salam. If we're looking for a precedent from the Quran, Musa alayhi salam, what did he have to do if he wanted to learn from Khidr? Did he ask Allah to bring Khidr to him, to come to his house, and so that he could ask Khidr his questions? And then when Musa was done his questions, like, okay, thank you very much, assalamu alaikum. Or here's your wage. No, Musa had to track him down, and he didn't know where he was. And he had to find, search and search and search, experience hardship, which proved his motivation and his desire. It proved his docility and his willingness to learn. And then even then, when he comes to Khidr, he has a problem because he's a little bit hasty, right? Which we talked about a bit ago. So these are very important things. And that all comes back to being docile, being willing to be molded. Being coachable is the most essential characteristic that a student can have. And that's the best compliment I've ever received in my life when I was in high school. Someone once said that I was coachable. And till this day, that's the best compliment I've ever received in my life. Because each person is like the earth. Some earth is soft and fertile and ready to accept the rain, and other earth is hard and they're not going to be able to absorb the rain at all. So which of these two is the average Muslim, young Muslim especially, that goes on YouTube and tries to learn their religion from YouTube, right? This is another version of bringing the imam to your house, right? It's like you see this list of videos, it's put at you like from an algorithm of what they think you're going to click on. And then you're like, oh, that looks interesting. Let me do that one. You're like, ooh, that looks interesting. Let me do that one. Or this guy looks legit. Let me try that. Right? Which is not real learning at the end of the day. If you're looking for YouTube videos for motivation, you want to hear like a motivational speech, okay, that's fine. But if you're looking to actually study and learn your religion, that's not how it happens. Again, you're putting yourself in the driver's seat. You're the one who's dictating when you get exposed to what and in what order. It's like somebody walking into a pharmacy and just being able to pick whatever they want off the shelf. Like, oh, my elbow hurts. Let me try this one. Maybe give me two of those, right? And they don't have any training to be able to differentiate between what are the side effects, what are the contraindications, et cetera, et cetera. And that comes back to the last point, and then I guess we'll have to end and we'll deal with the essential characteristics of teachers next class, inshallah, that the teacher has to pace the student and put them on a trajectory, expose them to things when they are ready for it. If you expose them to too much too early, it's either showing off from the teacher and or it's going to create too many doubts in the student. And this happens time and time and time again, especially with the age of social media and the internet. We have what's called context collapse, right? It used to be someone such as myself, if I go to have an academic discussion with other graduates of Islamic institutions, you know, PhDs, master students, people who are in the field studying, I can talk about very controversial things and know that there's a trust there, that we're talking about things in an academic way, that we're trying to search for the truth. I'm not going to throw anybody's faith in doubt by talking about these things. Whereas if I get on YouTube or I do a Facebook Live video about the same issues and you have anybody and everybody tuning in, then I'm going to cause people big problems, right? There needs to be context, you know, and everybody, there needs to be separation of audiences sometimes. And it's the teacher's job to make sure that they, and this was bleeding over to next chapter, but the teacher has to make sure that they're putting their student on a reasonable trajectory to succeed. That's one extreme, is exposing students too early, or students getting exposed too early to things they're not ready for. The other extreme is the gatekeeper, right? And we have, regretfully, a fair bit of those in our communities too, where somebody wants to come study the religion. They want to learn fiqh. And they're told, okay, well, you have to study this one book for 30 years before you can really do anything. And even then, you're not really going to be anything. You're just a beginner, right? We hear this sometimes. This is discouraging. This is very, very discouraging. And it's gatekeeping at the end of the day. We said last class that the sign of a sincere teacher is that they want their student to surpass them, and that they are cheering on their students. And that the sign of a sincere student is that they're cheering on their colleagues and classmates, and they are excited and celebrate their classmates surpassing them. And this gets back to the last thing, which is pretty much something we already said, that a beginning student should not listen to doubts. They shouldn't listen to those advanced sort of things where people are really getting into the nitty-gritty, right? The very fine details of some of the Quran riwayat, the very fine details of, you know, the manuscript preservation of Sahih al-Bukhari. Average Muslim, pray 5 times a day. What you find in Sahih al-Bukhari is correct. The Quran is 100% preserved. That's all you need to know. And it's true. It's not like people aren't lying to you, right? But when specialists are combating, let's say, like the doubts of the Orientalists and things like that, that's a conversation for a different audience. You don't belong in that conversation as a beginning student. You should just stay away from it. And actually, the person who is advanced and the scholar, they're required to engage with that material, whereas the beginner student, they're required to stay away from it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Any questions, anything at all before we wrap up? Again, I apologize for being late, and also don't have the live stream tonight. Had a little bit of a technical difficulty. Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much for attending. May Allah bless you and your families. And inshallah, we'll see you soon. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.